She was just a secretary, tired, overworked, holding her father's fragile life together in a crumbling house. He was her cold, unreadable millionaire boss with a past he never spoke of. They had nothing in common, except a contract that would bind their lives in the most unexpected way. Why would a man like Graham Hartman suddenly offer marriage not out of love, but as a transaction? What pain had frozen his heart so deeply that only silence could survive there? And why did Clara say yes, knowing it wasn't love? Or was it, in a world of boardrooms, legal clauses, and silent dinners, how did something so real, so human, begin to grow quietly, like light under a door? This isn't just a love story. It's a journey through broken trust, unspoken fears, and the slow, gentle miracle of healing. Stay with us as we unfold the tender, breathtaking story of a secretary's debt marriage, now her cold millionaire, boss can't let her go. If this story touches your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Let's begin. The sound of a knock on the old wooden door echoed through the kitchen like a verdict Clara wasn't ready to hear. It was a steady knock, not rushed, not urgent, just firm. The kind of knock that carried purpose, maybe even authority. It sliced cleanly through the quiet hum of the kitchen heater and the soft, labored breath of her father, sleeping in the next room. Clara didn't move at first. She stood by the sink, her hands wrapped tightly around a steaming mug of weak chamomile tea. The scent of dried flowers rose in faint curls with the steam, but it did little to soothe the tightness pressing against her chest. She glanced toward the hallway where the door to her father's room was cracked just enough for her to hear the rhythmic hiss of the oxygen machine, still steady, still alive. For now. Outside, the wind pushed against the loose panes of the window. A storm was coming, she could feel it, not in the sky, but in her bones, in the way the air pressed in just a little heavier than it had yesterday, in the way her name had appeared, again, in bold red ink on a foreclosure warning tucked between grocery coupons in that morning's mail. She exhaled, the kind of breath that carried more weariness than oxygen, and set the mug down on the kitchen counter, next to a stack of unopened bills. The envelopes were all familiar, now, same fonts, same language, the same low buzz of shame that followed her each time she dropped one into the drawer without reading it. Another knock, slower this time. She moved, slippers brushing across faded linoleum, cardigan sleeves too long for her arms pulled down over her hands. The porch light flickered once, then held. When she opened the door, the cold met her first sharp, biting, laced with the scent of pine and frozen earth. And then she saw him, Graham Hartman. He stood beneath the dim glow of the porch light, tall and composed in a dark overcoat, collar turned up against the wind. His gloved hands were at his sides, his expression unreadable. He looked completely out of place against the chipped paint of her front door and the tired screen door that hung just a little off its hinges, like a man who had stepped out of a world of glass towers and city lights and accidentally found himself on the front steps of someone else's struggle. "Mr. Hartman," she said, the words catching on her breath. He didn't answer at first, just looked at her, not rudely, not kindly either, just directly. His eyes were a kind of blue that looked colder in winter light. "I need a few minutes of your time," he said, his voice even deliberate. She blinked, her mouth opened, then closed again. Is something wrong with the reports? It's not about work," he interrupted gently. Though his tone still held that clipped professionalism she'd come to expect over the past 7 years of working beneath him, Clara glanced back over her shoulder. The kitchen light cast soft shadows on the hallway wall. She thought of her father in the next room, and of how fragile everything in her life had become lately. She hesitated, then stepped aside. Graham nodded once, stepped in, and closed the door behind him with a quiet finality that sent a small chill down her spine. He didn't remove his coat. He didn't sit. He merely stood in her kitchen, her too small, too cold, too lived-in kitchen, and looked around with the kind of gaze that didn't need to say what it noticed. The cracked floor tile, the buzzing refrigerator, the dried-out basil plant on the windowsill that hadn't been green since November. "I wasn't expecting visitors," she said, reaching for the towel draped over the handle of the oven, fidgeting with it to distract herself. "I imagine not," he replied. For a few seconds, silence stretched between them. The only sound was the occasional click of the heater, trying to do its job. Clara finally turned to him, arms crossed against her chest, more from habit than from cold. "So, why are you here?" Graham reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out a slim folder. He placed it gently on the table, careful not to let it slide on the worn surface. "I've acquired the outstanding debt on this property," he said, evenly, "and the medical bills attached to your father's care." Her heart stuttered. "But I purchased them this morning." The creditors were preparing to move forward with a lien on the property. She took a step back. Her stomach churned. "You bought our debt, I did." Why his jaw flexed slightly. "Because I'm offering a solution." Her breath caught in her throat. For weeks, she had been trying to find a solution, calling numbers on worn business cards, negotiating with people who didn't know her name and didn't care to. She had looked for a miracle, and now here he was, tall, cold, and carrying a folder with her name on it. But he wasn't here to save her. That much was clear. "I don't understand," she whispered. "This isn't charity, is it?" "No," he said. "It's a proposal." She blinked. "A proposal? A marriage contract?" He clarified. "1 year. In exchange, your debts are cleared. Completely." The folder sat between them like a stone dropped into still water, rippling shock into every corner of the kitchen. Clara stared at it, then at him, then back at it. "You want me to marry you?" Graham didn't nod, didn't soften. "This isn't about love, Clara. It's about necessity." And with those words, her world shifted quietly, but irreversibly. He didn't come to offer help. He came with paperwork. The folder sat between them like a silent ultimatum, its edges neat and corners unbent, far more composed than Clara's thoughts in that moment. She could barely hear the wind outside anymore. The ticking of the old wall clock seemed to slow, each second dragging under the weight of what he'd just said. Marriage, not for love, not even for appearances. Just a year-long exchange, a contract with a signature and a clause, a solution masked as salvation. Clara stared at Graham, her jaw clenched tighter than she realized. Her palms were clammy, despite the winter air. He was standing so still, as if nothing about this situation was unnatural, as if the proposition of marrying a woman for convenience and debt relief was no more personal than reviewing a quarterly report. Her voice, when it came, cracked slightly. "You want me to be your wife for 1 year," he said, evenly, publicly, legally. "At the end of the term, you walk away free, no debt, no obligation." She let out a bitter, quiet laugh. "No obligation. You're asking me to trade my name, my freedom, my entire life for a roof and a hospital bill." Graham didn't flinch. "I'm offering a contract, one that solves both of our problems." His words landed cold, clinical. The way he spoke. It was as if they were back in the boardroom, not in the middle of her worn-down kitchen where the wallpaper peeled at the edges and the smell of menthol rub lingered from her father's room. Clara looked down at the folder again, at the neatly stacked pages, typed, notarized, a pen tucked inside, waiting. "You've been planning this," she said, voice low. "This isn't impulsive." "No," he admitted. "I've considered it for weeks." She turned away, jaw tight, eyes burning. Her gaze fell on the hallway again, the oxygen machine still humming. A soft cough drifted through the thin walls. Then another, more violent. She could picture her father curled beneath that flannel blanket, shivering even when the space heater buzzed at his feet. She'd already sold her jewelry, her car, taken on weekend shifts at the diner, then let them go when her father's mobility declined. There was nothing left to cut. "You're not even pretending this is about anything more than a transaction," she whispered, back still to him. "No," He said, "Because it isn't." There was something infuriating about the way he admitted it. Not cruel, not smug, just blank. As if this didn't touch him the way it tore through her. She turned to face him again, her voice sharpened. "Why me? You could have found someone else, hired someone, a model, a socialite." His gaze didn't waver. "I needed someone I could trust, someone discreet, someone who wouldn't fall apart." The words struck like a slap. She flinched, not from insult, but from truth. He had seen her, seen how she held herself together, even when the seams were fraying. And still, he came here with a contract instead of compassion. Clara pressed her fingers to her temple, as if she could slow the pounding in her skull. "And what do you get out of it?" Graham paused for the first time. His jaw moved slightly, as though weighing what to say, an agreement that satisfies an inheritance clause. "It's complicated." Her breath caught. Of course, it wasn't about her, not really. It was about his world, his legacy, his cold empire built on conditions and clauses. She moved to the kitchen window, resting her hand on the sill. The glass was cold, fogged from the heat of the room inside. Beyond it, the world looked distant, quiet, as if none of this was real. Another cough echoed from the back room, this one longer, harsher. Her heart twisted. She turned around. "You knew I'd say yes." He didn't respond. "You walked in here knowing I was desperate enough to consider this." Still, he said nothing, and that silence said everything. She walked back to the table, each step heavier than the last. Her fingers brushed the edge of the folder. Then, slowly, she opened it, line after line of legal phrasing blurred in her vision. Terms, conditions, dates, requirements, her name typed in bold, his name underneath, a space for signatures at the bottom. Her eyes welled, but she blinked them dry. Not now, not in front of him. She picked up the pen, her hand trembled, she set it down. "What happens if I walk away?" she asked, barely louder than a whisper. "The bank takes your house," he replied, his voice like polished stone. "Your father's care ends immediately." She nodded slowly, absorbing the blow. Then, without another word, Clara picked up the pen again and signed, one line, then another. Her hand didn't stop shaking. Graham reached forward and closed the folder. It clicked shut like the lid of a coffin. "When does it start?" she asked. "Now," he said. "We'll file it tomorrow." She nodded once and stepped back. Her shoulders sagged as if 100 pounds had settled across her frame. He moved toward the door. At the threshold, he paused. "You'll receive a car tomorrow morning to begin arrangements. Bring what you need." Clara said nothing. And then he was gone. The door closed with a soft thud. She stood alone in the silence, surrounded by the scent of tea gone cold and a promise that felt more like a prison sentence. The house was beautiful, but it felt colder than the winter wind outside. Clara stepped out of the car into the pale light of late afternoon, her boots crunching softly on the gravel driveway. Before her stood the red brick estate, elegant and still, like a portrait too perfectly posed. Ivy crawled along the front columns, winter bare but persistent. The windows, tall and curtained, stared back at her like watching eyes. It wasn't just big, it was silent. Her fingers curled tighter around the handle of her small suitcase. The driver offered no words, just a nod toward the front door before returning to his seat and pulling away, tires whispering against the frost-dusted road. Clara lingered on the steps for a moment, taking in the weight of it all. The house, the contract, the beginning of something she couldn't yet name. The door opened before she could knock. "You must be Mrs. Hartman," came a voice warm and steady, though touched by time. The woman who greeted her was in her late 60s, maybe early 70s. A soft face, hair swept into a neat bun, and eyes that had seen too much but offered kindness anyway. "I'm Mrs. Alcott. I've managed the house for years." Clara hesitated. "Mrs. Hartman." The name didn't feel real. It felt like a borrowed coat, too large in the shoulders and unfamiliar to the skin. She forced a smile. Just Clara, please, Mrs. Alcott didn't argue. She stepped aside and let her in. Inside, the air was warmer, but only by degrees. The ceiling stretched impossibly high. Wooden floors gleamed under the soft glow of antique sconces. The place smelled of lemon polish and thyme. Clara's boots made gentle thuds as she walked across the grand entryway. There were no personal touches, no family photos, no shoes by the door, no coats draped over chairs. Everything was curated, careful, untouched. Mr. Hartman is in his study. Mrs. Alcott offered. Dinner is at 7. Clara nodded. Her room, now hers, apparently was upstairs, at the end of a long hallway. The space was lovely. Pale blue walls, heavy drapes, a fireplace that had already been lit. Her bags had been placed neatly at the foot of the bed. She sat down without removing her coat. Her hands rested on her knees, stiff and unsure. The room, for all its comfort, didn't belong to her. Nothing in this house did. At 6:58, she made her way downstairs. The dining room was formal long table, polished silver, crystal glasses. A single candelabra flickered at the center. Graham was already seated, reading something on his phone. He didn't look up when she entered. Clara sat across from him. They ate in silence. The clink of cutlery on porcelain was the only sound in the room. Mrs. Alcott served roast chicken with root vegetables and a cream soup to start. Everything was perfect. Everything was flavorless. Clara glanced at Graham once. He cut his food with mechanical precision, like always exact, measured, unreadable. She reached for her water, fingers brushing the edge of the glass too hard. It tipped slightly before she steadied it. He didn't notice, or pretended not to. After dinner, he stood and nodded politely. "Good night," he said, voice low but formal. Clara echoed the words, unsure why they felt so much heavier than they should have. She wandered into the kitchen after he left. The warmth of the oven still lingered. Mrs. Alcott was humming softly to herself as she wiped down the counters. "Would you like tea?" the older woman asked. Clara nodded. Mrs. Alcott moved gracefully, her motions familiar and gentle. She set a mug of chamomile tea in front of Clara, just like the one she used to drink at home. Clara wrapped her hands around it and held it without sipping, letting the warmth seep into her fingers. "Is it always this quiet here?" she asked after a while. Mrs. Alcott smiled faintly. "He doesn't keep company much. Not for a long time." Clara nodded, though the answer didn't bring comfort. Later that evening, unable to sleep, she wandered the hallways. The house was a maze of rooms and corridors, each one filled with beauty and emptiness in equal measure. A study with leather chairs no one sat in. A music room with a grand piano she doubted had been played in years. A sunroom with no sun. And then, as she passed by the library, she paused. Through the partially open door, she saw him. Graham stood near the fireplace, facing a table. A single framed photo sat beside a small stack of books. He wasn't touching it, just staring. Clara stepped back before he could notice her, heart thudding. Back in her room, she pulled the covers up but didn't close her eyes. The image of him alone in the firelight, watching a woman in a photo burn behind her eyelids. The house was beautiful, but beauty, she realized, had little to do with warmth. It didn't matter how high the ceilings were or how soft the sheets felt. It didn't matter that dinner was served on fine china or that her name had legally changed. Everything felt like glass, and she felt like something breakable behind it. Sometimes, love doesn't enter through words, but through the way someone folds your coat when you forget it by the door. It had started with small things. Things Clara wasn't sure she noticed at first. A mug placed near the stove, already filled with hot water when she walked in from the garden. An extra blanket folded at the foot of her bed on nights when the wind howled harder than usual through the old brick. There were no notes, no acknowledgments, just the quiet presence of care stitched into ordinary moments. One rainy Thursday morning, Clara left her scarf hanging on the coat rack in the foyer. She had been too distracted, her head buzzing with a dull ache. the kind that sat behind the eyes and made every sound seem louder. She only realized it was missing when she went to reach for it the next day. It wasn't just gone, it was clean, warm from the dryer, folded gently on the edge of her bedroom dresser. She stared at it for a long moment, fingertips brushing the soft wool. There were no housekeepers, no assistants, only Mrs. Alcott, and she had been off that day, which meant she didn't let her mind finish the thought. Another night? It rained harder, the kind of southern storm that seemed to come from nowhere fast, heavy, relentless. Clara had wandered too far into the side garden, lost in thought, and didn't hear the thunder until the sky cracked above her. By the time she reached the back steps, she was soaked through. But Graham was already there. He stood in the doorway, holding an umbrella not over himself, but stretched out toward her, shielding her from the worst of it. He didn't speak, just held it steady while she stepped past him, water dripping from her sleeves. When she turned to thank him, his eyes caught hers, and for the first time, they didn't look through her. They held her gaze, steady and searching. There was something behind them. Regret. Maybe. Or a quiet kind of tenderness trying not to be noticed. Neither of them said a word. That night, as she changed into dry clothes, Clara kept replaying the way he'd looked at her. It wasn't affection, not yet, but it wasn't cold, either. There were cracks in the ice, hairline, maybe, but there, a week later, she came down with a fever. Nothing dramatic, just a seasonal bug, the kind that settled in your throat and refused to leave. Her body ached, her eyes burned. She spent the day in bed, drifting in and out of restless sleep. Sometime in the evening, she awoke to the faint clink of porcelain. On the nightstand was a tray, a mug of warm lemon water, a folded cloth, 2 tablets of ibuprofen. She didn't remember asking for them. The hallway was quiet when she stepped out hours later. The house dim, but not dark. A soft amber light spilled from the study downstairs. She paused at the banister, breathing in the scent of cedar wood and something faintly herbal. The air felt different. Not warmer, exactly, but less empty. The next day, she tried to thank him. He didn't acknowledge it directly, just nodded once, as if to say, "You don't need to mention it." That was how it was between them. No declarations, no grand gestures, just quiet kindness folded into the fabric of routine. And then, one evening, the headache came. It started behind her eyes, pulsing and sharp. By dinner, she could barely focus on the fork in her hand. She excused herself early, climbing the stairs slowly, one hand braced on the banister. She lay down fully clothed, too exhausted to change, the light from the hallway still spilling under her door. And then somewhere between waking and dreaming, she felt it. A presence. Not in the room, but just outside. The faint creak of a floorboard, the softest shadow beneath the door. He was there. He hadn't knocked, hadn't spoken. He was just there, standing quietly in the hallway, keeping vigil over a woman who wasn't truly his wife. She didn't call out, didn't move, but she didn't sleep either. The light remained on for hours, and when she finally drifted off, it wasn't from exhaustion, but from the calm that settled knowing someone hadn't walked away. Under the shimmer of crystal chandeliers, truth has a way of surfacing when you least expect it. The gala was held at the Bellevue Hall in downtown Nashville, a place where money didn't whisper. It declared itself in polished marble floors and walls that echoed with old wealth. The kind of building where laughter was measured, eye contact was calculated, and everything was theater. Clara stepped out of the car behind Graham, her hand tucked lightly into the crook of his arm. Her dress, chosen by a stylist she had never met, shimmered like lake water beneath the light. Navy silk, off the shoulder, understated, elegant, but inside, she felt like a mannequin dressed for someone else's life. The moment they entered the grand ballroom, heads turned, people stared not rudely, but with that practiced curiosity that belonged to high society. A quick scan, a cataloging, names attached to faces, faces attached to stories. And when they couldn't place her, they whispered. Clara heard it in fragments as they passed. That's her new wife, doesn't look the type. Where did she come from? Graham didn't seem to notice, or didn't care. He greeted a few colleagues with polite nods, offered brief introductions. My wife, Clara. That phrase spoken with all the warmth of a weather report made her skin tighten. He didn't look at her when he said it, but every time he did, the whispers surged again. The ballroom pulsed with light and movement. Waiters glided past with glasses of champagne. A jazz trio played near the stage, melodies smooth as bourbon. Clara smiled when she had to, nodded when expected, and tried to breathe between each encounter. But something about the air here was thinner. She found a quiet moment near the edge of the ballroom, her fingers brushing the rim of a glass she hadn't touched. The lights above her danced across the crystal like stars underwater. From a distance, this world looked magical. Up close, it smelled like perfume and power. And then she appeared, Marilyn Fairchild. Every inch of her seemed designed to command attention. Tall, angular, dressed in red silk that clung to her like second skin. Her earrings sparkled like ice. Her smile, practiced, sharp. She made her way through the crowd with the grace of someone born to be watched, and she was people parted for her. Eyes followed. Clara knew, without needing introduction, that this was someone who knew Graham well. Too well. Marilyn stopped in front of them, her gaze landing squarely on Clara before she even acknowledged Graham. Well, she purred. I suppose congratulations are in order. Clara opened her mouth to respond, but Marilyn's attention had already shifted. Graham, she said, drawing out his name like a secret. I didn't realize you were in the business of marrying your staff now. Or is this one of your charity projects? The words were coated in sugar, but the poison underneath was unmistakable. Graham's jaw tensed, just slightly. This is Clara, my wife. Marilyn arched a brow. So, I heard. She turned to Clara again. He used to hate these events. Said they were full of people pretending to care. A beat passed. I suppose people change. Clara held her ground, but her spine stiffened. Marilyn leaned in, voice low. Just be careful, dear. The last time Graham made something look real, someone ended up shattered. And with that, she disappeared into the crowd, her heels clicking like punctuation marks. Clara stood motionless for a moment. Her chest felt tight, like her ribs were closing in around her lungs. When she turned to Graham, he was already looking away, scanning the room as if nothing had happened. Who is she? Clara asked quietly. He didn't answer. Graham, still nothing. His silence cut deeper than any insult Marilyn could have thrown. He finally spoke, but only to say, we should make the rounds. There are people expecting to meet you. She stared at him, stunned. That's it. He looked at her then, briefly, let's not do this here. And just like that, the moment cracked. The night lost its shape. Clara stepped back, her breath caught on something sharp in her throat. The music, the lights, the polished laughter, it all turned into noise. Distant, distorted, meaningless. She turned. She walked away before she could change her mind. No one stopped her. Outside, the rain had started again, gentle at first, then heavier. She didn't have an umbrella. She didn't care. Her heels clicked across the wet pavement until she reached the car, but she didn't get in. Instead, she kept walking past doormen who didn't look twice, past gleaming storefronts whose reflections blurred with each drop on the glass. She wasn't sure where she was going. All she knew was that she couldn't breathe in there. Not with people smiling at her face and tearing her apart with their eyes. Not with Graham's silence closing like a door she didn't have the key to. And maybe, not with this aching thing in her chest that was beginning to look like hope. Because hope, when crushed, didn't just hurt. It humiliated. And Clara Whitmore had spent too many years learning how to swallow pride for someone else's comfort. Some goodbyes are silent. They come in the form of unanswered questions and the weight of a closing door. The house was quiet when Clara heard the voice. It wasn't loud. In fact, it was almost too soft to catch drifting through the half-open door of Graham's study late one evening, after she had come down for a glass of water. She wasn't trying to eavesdrop. She was halfway past when his voice, low, strained, caught something inside her chest. "I understand. Let's discuss finalizing the terms ahead of schedule." A pause. "No. She hasn't said anything. It'll be clean." Another pause. Then silence. Clara stood frozen at the edge of the hallway, fingers tightening around the glass in her hand. Her pulse throbbed in her ears. She didn't need the rest of the conversation. Those few words were enough. Finalizing the terms. Ahead of schedule. Clean. He wasn't just preparing to end the contract. He was already treating it as if it had meant nothing. Like it was a deal that had served its function and now could be filed away. Like every other impersonal arrangement in his curated world. For a moment, Clara couldn't move, couldn't think. The memory of the gala flashed through her mind, Marilyn's voice, the looks, the whispers, the way Graham hadn't defended her. And now, this. As if she'd imagined the softness in his eyes those quiet nights. As if the tea by her bed, the folded scarf, the moments that had started to feel real, were never meant to be. She turned and walked back upstairs, one hand brushing the wall to steady herself. In her room, the lamp cast a soft glow over the suitcase tucked in her closet. She hadn't touched it since the day she arrived, until now. Clara packed slowly, methodically, not in anger, not even in haste, just quietly, as if by folding her clothes neatly, she could preserve whatever dignity she had left. She didn't cry, not yet. She left no note. She simply zipped the bag, slipped on her coat, and walked past the dark hallway where Graham still sat on the phone with his lawyer. He didn't hear her, or maybe he did, and chose not to stop her. Either way, the silence said everything. Outside, the night air stung her cheeks. The cab she'd called was waiting at the end of the driveway. The driver didn't ask questions, just loaded her bag into the trunk and pulled away, tires crunching over the gravel. As the estate disappeared behind her, Clara looked out the window, her reflection faint against the glass. She felt empty. Like someone who'd just ended a marriage that had never really begun. The drive to Savannah was long and quiet. The trees lining the road were bare, their limbs clawing into the gray morning sky. Clara watched them pass in a blur, her breath fogging the window. She hadn't told anyone she was coming. She wasn't even sure what she would say when she arrived. The familiar sights of her hometown unfolded: gently gas stations with chipped signs, mailboxes leaning with age, the scent of pine and salt water carried on the wind. The air here felt heavier, more honest. It didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was. When the car pulled up to her father's small white house, the porch light was still on, but inside, something had changed. Mrs. Ellerby, the neighbor who had helped Clara watch over her father in recent weeks, met her at the door, eyes tired and lips pursed. "He's at the hospital," she said softly. "It happened last night. I tried to call, but your number didn't go through." Clara's breath caught. "Is he?" Mrs. Ellerby shook her head. "Alive? Barely. But you should go. Now." The hospital was cold in a different way than Graham's house had been. Here, the cold came from too much bleach, too many fluorescent lights, and the quiet beeping of machines that clung to life. Her father looked smaller than she remembered. Clara sat by his bed, her hands trembling as she reached for his. The oxygen mask made his breath shallow and mechanical. His skin was pale, papery thin. "I'm here, Daddy," she whispered. "I'm sorry it took me so long." She didn't know if he could hear her, but she kept talking anyway. She talked about the weather, about the little yellow flowers blooming near the fence out back, about how she hadn't forgotten how he liked his tea. She talked like it was Sunday afternoon and nothing was wrong, because if she let silence in, she might fall apart. She rested her head near his shoulder, The soft hum of machines, a lullaby of sorrow. She didn't cry. Not yet. Clara never expected to see him again, not in that hospital hallway. Not with those eyes full of something that looked like regret. The days blurred together after her father was moved to palliative care. The hallway lights never dimmed, and the scent of disinfectant clung to Clara's clothes no matter how often she changed them. She slept in the chair beside his bed, feet tucked under her, hand resting on his. Every morning, she brought him tea even if he was too weak to drink it. She played his favorite old country songs on her phone. Sometimes, he opened his eyes. Sometimes, he didn't. But she kept showing up. And then on the fourth day he did. Graham. He stood at the end of the corridor in a navy coat, his frame taller than she remembered. Or maybe it was just the weight he carried now, something in his posture that seemed different. His face was drawn, eyes dark under sleepless lids. Their eyes met. Clara didn't move. Neither did he. For a moment, the only sound was the soft beep of a heart monitor behind her. Then she turned back into the room without a word. But she felt it the way her chest tightened. Not with anger, but with confusion, sorrow, something tangled and raw. Graham didn't try to speak that day. He sat outside her father's room, not in the hallway, but on the bench just by the window, where the afternoon sun cast long shadows on the floor. He didn't leave when visiting hours ended. He stayed, hands folded, eyes distant. Clara saw him each time she walked down the hall. Sometimes she passed him. Sometimes she paused. Once, she brought him a paper cup of coffee and left it beside him without a word. That night, she found a folded blanket draped across the bench where he slept. No one else had brought it. On the sixth evening, Clara stepped out of the room after the nurse's check-in. Her shoulders slumped, her eyes rimmed red. She spotted Graham sitting in his usual place. She didn't look away this time. Instead, she walked over and sat beside him. They didn't speak. Outside the window, the sky turned the soft color of lavender dusk. The hum of vending machines echoed in the background. For a long time, the silence between them was steady comforting in its own way. Then she whispered, "He asked about you yesterday. Called you the quiet one." Graham's mouth twitched. "That sounds like him?" Another pause. Then Clara said, more softly, "Why did you come?" He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "Because I should have never let you leave without telling you the truth." She nodded once. "You didn't have to." "I did." He said, "And I didn't. And that's the part I've lived with every day since." That was all. No long explanations, no apologies that sounded rehearsed. But she felt it in the way his voice cracked at the edges, in the way he leaned slightly forward, like trying to reach across a distance he hadn't realized he'd built. Later that night, her father stirred for the last time. Clara held his hand while he labored to breathe. The machines had grown quieter. The nurses dimmed the lights. The world, for a moment, stood still. Graham stood behind her, silent, present. Then, just before her father's final breath, he opened his eyes. They were cloudy but focused. He looked at Clara, then at Graham, and then, in a rasp barely louder than a breath, he reached out. Clara stepped aside, unsure what he meant. Graham knelt, surprised. "Mr." Whitmore's hand gripped his weakly. He pulled him close. No one heard what he whispered, but Clara saw it. She saw the way Graham's shoulders tensed, the way his eyes flooded with something unexpected. And then, for the first time since she'd met him, he cried. Not loudly, not with drama, but with quiet, uncontrollable grief, the kind that didn't need sound to shake a person. Her father's hand fell limp shortly after. The funeral was held 3 days later in the little white church Clara had attended as a child. The pews creaked with the weight of mourners' neighbors, friends, a few old colleagues of her father. She wore black, simple, modest. Graham sat at the very back. He didn't approach, didn't speak, but he stayed until the last hymn faded, after everyone had gone. Clara stood outside, the breeze pulling at her coat. The sun was low, casting the field in honeyed light. She turned toward the gravel path leading to the road, and there he was. Graham walked slowly, no briefcase, no suit, just him. His eyes met hers, and for once, neither of them looked away. He stopped a few feet from her. No contract between them, no silence heavy with guilt, just two people, stripped bare by grief and memory, standing in the soft light of everything they didn't say before. Sometimes the past is stored in a box, dusty, sealed, but never forgotten. The house felt different when Clara returned. It wasn't the same coldness she remembered from her first night there. The air still carried that faint scent of lemon polish and old wood, but something had softened. Maybe it was the grief still lingering in her chest, or maybe it was the quiet way Graham had opened the front door and waited not out of duty, but as if the place didn't feel complete without her. She hadn't planned to stay long, just to gather a few things. A coat she'd left, a sketchbook her father once gave her, tucked into one of the guest drawers. Closure, perhaps. Graham didn't follow her upstairs. He simply said, "Take all the time you need," and disappeared into the study. She wandered through the quiet halls, letting her fingers drift across the banister, her steps slow and unhurried. The house didn't echo the same way it once had. It absorbed her presence now, instead of rejecting it. At the end of the hallway, a narrow door she hadn't noticed before stood slightly ajar. Curious. Clara pulled it open and found a steep staircase leading upward into shadows. The attic. Dust floated in the air like snow as she climbed. Each step creaked beneath her, the wood old but steady. The attic was spacious but cluttered old trunks, wooden chairs, covered portraits leaning against the walls. It smelled like forgotten summers and the passage of time. In the far corner, beneath a sheet yellowed with age, was a small cedar chest. She hesitated before touching it. Her fingers trembled slightly as she lifted the lid. Inside were papers, photographs, old letters tied with twine. At the top lay a black and white photograph of a younger Graham, sharper features, eyes less guarded. He stood next to a woman with dark curls and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Clara didn't need a name. She already knew. Marilyn. Under the photo was a stack of letters, some addressed in Graham's handwriting, others in Marilyn's. Clara read a few. Sweet at first, affectionate, filled with plans and promises. Then, slowly, the tone shifted. Words became colder. Doubt seeped through the sentences. One envelope wasn't sealed. Inside was a letter never sent. She unfolded it carefully. "I thought loving you would be enough. But what do you do with love that's never real in return? You said you cared, but I always felt the distance like I was being measured against something invisible. I would have given you everything. But in the end, I wasn't what you wanted. I wish you'd been someone else. Or maybe I wish I had been someone else. Someone you could love, not for what I had, but for who I was without it." Clara's eyes stung as she read the final line, scrawled hastily in ink that had bled slightly over time. "I wish you were someone who could love me without the price tag." She folded the letter back with reverent care, as if touching a wound still fresh. The pain in Graham's voice, the distance in his actions, the silence he clung to, they weren't born from cruelty. They were remnants of something broken long ago. And unlike her, he hadn't been given space to grieve it. He'd just built walls. Clara reached deeper into the chest and pulled out a worn leather journal. Only a few pages were filled. One entry stood out, November 3rd. "I passed her on the sidewalk today. Marilyn, she looked happy. I wasn't surprised. The funny thing is, I didn't feel anger, just tired. Like I'd finally run out of ways to keep pretending I didn't care. People tell you to move on, but they don't tell you what to do with the version of yourself you lost in the process." She closed the journal gently, sitting there on the attic floor, the late afternoon light filtering through the tiny round window. Clara realized she wasn't angry anymore, not at him, not even at the arrangement that had brought them together. She understood now. He had once believed in love, believed deeply, and when it had been stripped away, not by a dramatic betrayal, but by the slow erosion of being used. It had hollowed him. No wonder he had hesitated. No wonder he had built rules instead of relationships. And yet, here he was, trying again. Not with words, but with presence. With quiet coffee cups, with showing up in Savannah, with staying through her father's final breath. He hadn't said he loved her, but maybe, in the language he still remembered, he had been trying to show it. Clara folded the letter, her hand pressing against her heart. She wasn't Marilyn. She had no past with him, only the fragile beginnings of a future. But would he believe that? Would he let himself try again? They stood side by side, saying nothing, and yet, in that stillness, something shifted forever. The rain had returned that evening, a soft drizzle, like the sky was exhaling gently after holding its breath too long. It tapped against the porch roof in a rhythm steady and slow, like a heartbeat barely heard. Clara sat in the wooden rocking chair her father had once mended, her knees tucked beneath a blanket, the scent of old pine and earth curling in the air. Across from her, Graham leaned on the railing, arms folded loosely, his eyes lost in the grayness of the trees beyond. They hadn't planned to sit there together. She had simply stepped outside for air and found him already there. Neither said a word, but neither went back in. The silence wasn't heavy like it used to be. It was something else now, not avoidance, not discomfort, just presence, the kind that didn't ask for explanation. They sat that way for a long time. The porch light above them flickered slightly in the mist. Somewhere in the distance, a wind chime sang faintly, pulled by the breeze. Clara's fingers curled around the edge of her blanket. She could feel the throb of her heartbeat in her throat steady, persistent. Graham turned slightly, just enough that she could see the outline of his face in the dim light. "My mother used to sit like this," he said quietly, his voice nearly lost to the rain. "She loved watching storms, said they were the only time the world felt honest." Clara looked at him. She was gentle, he continued, warm. She had this laugh that could make you forget what was wrong for a while. He paused. "My father wasn't like that. He didn't believe in softness, said emotions made you weak. That love was a currency, one you didn't spend unless you got something in return." Clara listened, each word stitching itself into the spaces between them. "I used to think—" "Maybe he was right," Graham said, his voice lower now. "After Marilyn, it was easier to believe that." Clara's breath caught, but he didn't look at her. He stared into the rain like it held all the answers he never dared to ask. "I built a world where everything was transaction, predictable, safe." He swallowed, and then you showed up with tea stains on your cuffs and worry in your eyes. And I didn't know what to do with that. The rocking chair creaked softly beneath her as she shifted. "I've been afraid too," Clara said. He turned his head toward her. She didn't avert her gaze. "I was afraid I was just another placeholder, another version of someone else, that I'd been chosen because I was convenient, not because I mattered." Her voice trembled slightly, but she didn't stop. "I was scared that I would start to care, and be reminded that it wasn't real." The rain fell heavier for a moment, as if it, too, had something to say. Then slowly, without hesitation, Graham stepped across the porch and sat beside her. Not too close, just close enough. His hand, tentative, rested on the armrest between them. And then, as if unsure of the answer, but willing to risk it anyway, he reached for her hand. His palm was warm, a little rough at the edges. Their fingers didn't interlock right away, but they didn't pull away either. Clara's eyes stayed fixed on the horizon, but her chest rose sharply. His thumb brushed gently against hers, more like a question than a gesture. Then he said it quietly, barely above a whisper. "Clara, I'm afraid to lose you." There it was, not a confession, not a declaration, just truth, raw, unvarnished. Clara blinked, not because of the rain or the chill, but because something inside her, something tightly held, was beginning to soften. She didn't speak, but she let her hand settle into his. She let her fingers curve, naturally, until they fit the spaces between his, and they sat like that, hand in hand, side by side, beneath the gentle percussion of rain. Nothing else needed to be said. The letter came on a rainy Tuesday unmarked, unsigned, but impossible to ignore. It had been one of those days where the world seemed wrapped in a quiet grayness, the kind of day that pressed against the windows and asked you to sit still. Clara had been folding laundry in the living room, the low hum of the dryer her only company, when she heard the soft thud of the mailbox. She almost didn't check it, but some faint tug, instinct maybe, led her out onto the front steps, barefoot, the wooden floor still warm under her soles. There, tucked inside a plain envelope with no return address, was her name, Clara Whitmore. The handwriting was gentle, feminine, old-fashioned. She turned the envelope over, no seal, just a faint watermark pressed into the corner. Aggies Estes, initials she didn't recognize at first. And then, with a slow, dawning clarity, she remembered Graham's mother, Lenore Wren Hartman. Clara stood there for a moment, the rain drizzling around her in a soft whisper. She clutched the envelope like it might dissolve if she breathed too hard. Back inside, she sat by the window, light dim, the room filled with the scent of fresh linen and old memories. She opened the envelope with careful hands, as if whatever was inside had waited too long to be rushed. The letter was handwritten in navy ink, the strokes elegant, sure. There were small smudges along the edges as if the writer had paused, reflected, perhaps even cried. Dear Clara, if you are reading this, it means I have already left this world, and perhaps it means my son has finally opened the parts of himself I feared he had locked away forever. I do not write easily to strangers, but I do not believe you were a stranger not to me. I've seen you before. Not in person, not formally, but I saw you once at a gala, standing alone with such grace while the room turned its sharp teeth toward you. I watched the way you carried your silence like dignity, the way you looked at my son like you saw more than his wealth or his reputation. That day, I knew something he didn't. You would be the one to break the curse. Graham is my greatest joy and my greatest sorrow. He learned to build walls before he ever learned how to build trust, and I carry the blame for much of that. I stayed quiet when I should have spoken. I stood behind his father when I should have stepped between them. But you have done what I could not. You taught him how to feel again, not through grand gestures, but through the way you remained when leaving would have been easier. There is something holy in that. Thank you, Clara. Thank you for loving my son with patience, for being kind when he didn't know how to return it, for staying when his silence tried to push you away. He may never say these things aloud, but I know them. And now, so do you. Please know, wherever I am now, I am at peace, knowing he is finally in the presence of someone who sees him not as a name, or an account, or a burden, but simply as a man. All my warmth. Lenore Clara didn't realize she was crying until she felt the tears on her wrists. They came quietly, no sobs, no shaking, just a steady stream of something old being released, a kind of grief she hadn't named before. This woman, who had only seen her from afar, who never introduced herself, never shook Clara's hand, never sat beside her at a table, and yet, in just a few lines, had given her the one thing she didn't even know she'd been aching for. Recognition, not from society, not from Graham's colleagues, not even from Graham himself, but from someone who mattered in a different way, a mother, a witness, a blessing. She sat curled in the armchair by the window, letter in her lap, one hand pressed gently to her chest. That's where Graham found her. He must have come in quietly, no footsteps, no voice, just his presence, settling into the room like dusk. His eyes landed on the letter, then on her. I didn't know she wrote you, he said softly, his voice filled with something not quite sadness but reverence. Clara looked up. Her eyes were rimmed with salt, but clear. She saw me. She whispered, Even when I didn't know anyone was watching, she saw me. Graham stepped closer, his face unreadable. Then, without a word, he sat beside her and pulled her gently into his arms. There was no urgency, no passion, just a stillness that held both of them in its arms. He didn't ask what the letter said. He didn't need to, because the way she held it against her chest, the way she leaned into him, quietly, completely said more than any explanation could. She never wore a white dress, never walked an aisle, but in his eyes, she had already said yes. There was no grand cathedral, no polished aisle, no flower girl tossing petals down a path of promises. But the living room was filled with the scent of roasted rosemary chicken and cinnamon candles. The fireplace glowed softly, and outside, the wind moved through the trees like an old hymn. Graham had planned a small dinner, quiet, familiar, just neighbors, old friends from the town, and Mrs. Alcott, who now smiled more than she used to. Clara had helped set the table, polishing the mismatched silverware that had once belonged to Graham's grandmother, smoothing out the linen napkins one by one. The evening moved gently, like a slow waltz. Laughter bubbled between stories. Glasses clinked in toasts that didn't feel rehearsed. And Clara, sitting beside Graham at the head of the long wooden table, felt something she hadn't known she was missing. Belonging. Not as an ornament. Not as a condition of a contract, but as herself. When dessert was nearly served and conversation turned soft and scattered, Clara quietly rose from her seat. She didn't clear her throat, didn't ask for attention. She simply stood, holding a folded piece of paper between her fingers, eyes focused not on the room, but on the man beside her. And then she began. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried. It threaded through the room like something sacred. I never got to write vows before. No one asked me to. No aisle waited, no guests, no veil. But tonight, I want to say what I would have said had I been given the chance back then. Graham, I didn't fall in love with you the way books describe. It wasn't fireworks. It wasn't grand confessions. It was tea left on a nightstand, a scarf quietly folded, a man who sat outside a hospital room because he didn't know how to say the right words but still showed up. I want to promise you that I don't need perfection. I don't even need certainty. I just need the version of you that's honest, present, the one who listens in silence, who stays when it would be easier to walk away. Thank you for teaching me that love doesn't always arrive dressed in flowers and lace. Sometimes it arrives with bruises and regrets and still stays. I vow to see you, not the man in the papers, not the boss, just the man who once forgot how to trust and still found his way back. You were never supposed to be my story, but now I can't imagine it without you. When she finished, there was a stillness that pressed gently over the entire room. Some guests wiped at their eyes. Others simply bowed their heads. But Clara didn't see any of it. Her eyes had never left Graham, and his had never left her. For a moment, he didn't move, didn't speak. Then he stood. He walked to her with no ceremony, no speech, just quiet steps that carried the weight of years and the softness of now. He reached into his pocket, and there it was, a ring, simple, no diamonds, no flourish, just a slender band of gold that caught the light like a whisper. Without a word, he took her hand. He slid the ring onto her finger with reverence, not urgency. And when he looked at her, his eyes were shining not with pride or passion, but with something gentler. Gratitude, peace, love, the kind that doesn't ask to be proven, the kind that's already there. The guests stood and applauded, but neither of them heard it. They stood wrapped in each other's presence, forehead to forehead, the kind of silence between them that held more truth than words could carry. Clara didn't wear white, but in his eyes, she was a bride, and in her heart, she was finally home. In a world where everything had once begun with signatures and silence, tonight ended with a promise not written on paper, but etched in something far more permanent. It wasn't the house, the name, or the money. It was the way he looked at her that made her feel home. The morning sun filtered through the porch screen in soft, golden ribbons. Clara stood barefoot on the wide wooden steps, her cardigan draped loosely over her shoulders, and her daughter nestled against her chest, blinking slowly in the warmth. Savannah, just 9 months old, had tufts of sandy brown hair and a sleepy smile that looked exactly like her father's after a long day. She made a soft sound, somewhere between a yawn and a coo, and Clara gently kissed the top of her head. The yard stretched before them, lush, quiet, humming with late summer life. The hydrangeas had burst into bloom, a sea of blue and white along the fence line, and near the far end of the lawn. Graham was pushing the mower in his usual methodical lines, sleeves rolled up, brow furrowed in concentration. "Be careful with those tiny feet there," he called out, pausing when he saw them. He grinned, wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, and pointed toward the porch. "That one's getting taller every time I blink." Clara smiled, heart blooming with something gentle and rooted. This was not the life she had imagined for herself. It was better. The house that once felt cavernous and cold had become a home, not because of the walls or the renovations, but because of the rhythm that now pulsed within it, midnight feedings, shared laughter in the kitchen, small arguments that ended with quiet apologies and lingering embraces. Every corner now held memory. The kitchen table where they wrote grocery lists and drew stick figures for Savannah to giggle at. The hallway where Graham danced with Clara once, awkwardly, barefoot, just because a song had come on that reminded him of her. The front room where Clara kept her father's old sketchbook, now filled with quick drawings of her daughter sleeping, of Graham reading, of morning light casting soft lines on their floor. Peace, she had learned, wasn't a place. It was a choice made over and over again, with hands, with words, with silence. That afternoon, when Savannah napped, Clara found herself in the small writing nook by the bedroom window. The leather-bound journal lay open, the same one she had started the day she first arrived at the estate under the weight of a contract. She picked up her pen slowly, thoughtfully. "I once believed I was bound by obligation," she wrote, "but now I know I was chosen." Her hand paused, heart full. Chosen by a man who didn't know how to say "I love you" out loud, but said it through how he held our daughter at 3 a.m., through how he makes sure my tea is steeped just the way I like it, through how he looks at me not as someone he owns, but as someone he's still grateful I stayed. She closed the journal gently, letting her fingers linger on the cover. Later, as the day faded into dusk, Clara sat on the grass with Savannah propped beside her. The sky was awash in amber and coral, the air soft with the scent of honeysuckle and fresh earth. Graham came over, tossing his gloves onto a chair. "She awake?" Clara nodded. "Barely. But she doesn't want to miss the sunset." He chuckled, sitting behind Clara, wrapping his arms loosely around her as they watched the horizon melt into softness. Then it happened, so small, so sudden. Savannah shifted forward, lifted herself onto shaky feet, and took her very first step. Then another and another. Graham's breath caught. Clara didn't move. They both instinctively opened their arms, ready, steady, waiting, and Savannah collapsed into them both, squealing with delight, tiny fists clutching at their shirts like victory banners. Tears welled in Clara's eyes, uninvited but not unwelcome. Graham looked at her, something unspoken in his expression. They had missed so many firsts together, so much love lost in translation, but not this one. This was theirs, fully. That night, after Savannah had fallen asleep with her stuffed lamb curled under her arm, Clara stood by the nursery doorway, watching Graham tuck the blanket just a little tighter around their daughter. He turned, eyes soft, and reached for her hand. No words. They didn't need any. The kind of love they had now didn't beg to be named out loud. It lived in the quiet between heartbeats, in the choices they made to stay, to forgive, to grow, in the promise not of forever, but of every single day chosen deliberately. And so, their story didn't end with a contract torn or a dramatic declaration. It ended, and began again, with a porch bathed in sunlight, with tiny feet learning to walk, with two people who had once been strangers to love, learning how to come home to each other. Because love, she now knew, wasn't the grand beginning. It was the gentle staying, certainly. Below is a 200-word life lesson reflection drawn from the story, written in warm, thoughtful language tailored to resonate with an older audience. Life doesn't always give us love wrapped in the package we expect. Sometimes, it arrives in silence, in sacrifice, in the quiet persistence of two people learning to stay when it's easier to walk away. Clara and Graham's story is a reminder that healing isn't always loud, and love isn't always instant. True connection grows in the everyday, a warm cup of tea left at your bedside, a quiet hand held during grief, a shared silence that feels safe. We often guard our hearts out of fear, pain, or past betrayals. But healing begins the moment we allow someone to see us, not the version we present to the world, but the real, imperfect self beneath. And when someone chooses to love that part of us, not out of obligation, but freely, that's when home is found. In a world of quick fixes and rushed emotions, this story invites us to slow down, to notice the small things, and to believe that even the most broken hearts can find their way back to tenderness. Because sometimes, the most powerful promise isn't spoken, it's felt. Thank you for spending your time with us and allowing this story to touch your heart. If you felt moved by Clara and Graham's journey, we invite you to share it with someone who needs a little hope today. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more heartfelt stories that heal, inspire, and remind us of the quiet strength of love. Your support means the world to us. See you in the next story.